Can you imagine waking up in pain every single day for 3 years, only to decide on your wedding morning that you're going to attempt the impossible? In this video, you'll learn how a woman with permanent nerve damage in her spine stood up and walked down the aisle when doctors said her chance of recovery was very low. The morning of October 14th arrived the way all sacred mornings do. Quietly, without announcement, carrying the weight of everything that had led to this single point in time. Imani Adiz Okafor woke up at 5:17 in the morning, not because an alarm had pulled her from sleep, but because her body, as it so often did, had decided that rest was a luxury she was not yet entitled to. The pain in her lower spine had been speaking to her in its usual language. Dull, persistent, unmerciful, a language she had spent the last 3 years learning to translate into something survivable. She lay still for a long moment in the hotel room that her mother and her 2 best friends had booked for the night before the wedding. The ceiling above her was plain and white, unmarked by anything significant, and yet Imani stared at it as though it held the answers to every question she had been carrying for 3 years, 2 months and 17 days. Today was her wedding day. She let that thought settle into her chest like warm water. Today, she would marry Darius Emmanuel Whitfield, the man who had sat beside her hospital bed during the worst week of her life and held her hand without saying a single unnecessary word. The man who had learned, alongside her, what it meant to love someone whose body had become a battleground. The man who had never once looked at the wheelchair the way other people did, with that particular mixture of pity and discomfort that she had come to recognize in the eyes of strangers, co-workers, and even some people she had once called close friends. Imani pushed herself carefully to a sitting position, the motion practiced and deliberate, the way all her motions had become over time. Her body was not what it used to be. She understood that now with the kind of hard-won clarity that only comes from fighting something you cannot win and choosing, despite that, to keep fighting anyway. She reached for her phone on the nightstand and checked the time again. 5:19. Outside the window of the Atlanta hotel, the city was still half asleep, its skyline barely visible through the pre-dawn gray. In 4 hours and 41 minutes, she would be at the altar of Greater Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church on the west side of Atlanta, surrounded by 247 guests, standing before God and her community, pledging herself to the man she loved. Except she would not be standing. That was the part that had kept her awake the night before. Not the dress, not the flowers, not the vows she had written and rewritten 11 times in the last month. What had kept her awake was the image she could not stop returning to, the image of herself rolling down that aisle, the sound of the wheels on the polished church floor, the sea of faces watching her, watching the chair, and the complicated alchemy of emotions that image stirred inside her. She was not ashamed of the wheelchair. She had made her peace with that particular battle long ago, or at least she had made something that resembled peace, something that functioned well enough in the daylight hours. But a wedding was different. A wedding was the one occasion in a woman's life when the world had agreed to watch her, to witness her, to see her in a specific and sacred way, and there was still a part of Imani, a quiet, stubborn, deeply human part, that had dreamed, for as long as she could remember, of walking down that aisle. Not rolling. Walking. She had not told anyone that. Not her mother. Not her bridesmaids. Not even Darius. Because saying it out loud would have meant having to manage everyone else's feelings about it, and she was tired of managing feelings, hers and other people's, around the subject of what her body could and could not do. What she had told no one was this. For the past 11 weeks, in secret, in the early morning hours before her physical therapist arrived and after her mother had gone to bed, Imani Okafor had been trying to stand up. Not because her doctors had told her to. In fact, her primary physician, Dr. Renee Moss, a precise, careful woman who delivered information with a kind of measured compassion that came from years of giving people news they did not want to hear, had been clear with Imani the last time they had spoken about it. The nerve damage in your lumbar spine, Dr. Moss had said, in that quiet office with the diplomas on the wall and the small succulent on the windowsill, is significant. I want you to continue with physical therapy because it supports your overall quality of life, your upper body strength, your circulation. But Imani, and here the doctor had paused in the specific way that doctors paused when they were about to say something they wished they did not have to say, the likelihood of you regaining full ambulatory function is very low. I don't want you to build your hope around an outcome that the medical evidence does not support. Imani had nodded. She had thanked Dr. Moss for her time. She had driven home with her mother, who had cried silently in the passenger seat the whole way, And she had gone to her room and she had cried too. A full, private, thorough cry that lasted nearly an hour. And then, the next morning, she had started trying to stand up. Not because she disbelieved Dr. Moss. She was not a woman who dealt in delusion. She had a graduate degree in public health from Spelman College. She understood evidence. She understood probability. She understood that hope untethered from reality was just another word for denial. But she also understood something that Dr. Moss, with all of her expertise and all of her compassion, could not measure on any scan or assess with any diagnostic tool. She understood that the human body, the black woman's body in particular, trained by centuries of history to endure what should not be endurable, sometimes did things that confounded the reasonable predictions of science. And she understood that she had a wedding on October 14th. So she had tried. Every morning. Quietly, stubbornly, faithfully. Most mornings, she managed to get her legs under her for a few seconds. Trembling, unreliable, painful seconds, before her body gave way and she had to lower herself back down. A few mornings, she had managed something that might generously be called a step, though it was more of a controlled fall in a forward direction than anything resembling actual locomotion. She had not told a single soul. She had prayed. Not the broad, general prayers of a woman going through the motions of faith, but the specific, urgent, cellular prayers of a woman who believed. Not without doubt, not without fear, but genuinely, stubbornly believed, that the God who had made her body also had the power to restore it. And now it was October 14th. Her mother, Celestine Okafor, knocked on the hotel room door at 5:30 exactly. Because Celestine was the kind of woman who knocked on doors at precisely the time she said she would, and this had been true for all of Imani's 31 years on Earth. Celestine was a tall, dark-skinned woman from Lagos by way of Atlanta, with silver-streaked locks piled high on her head and a way of moving through the world that communicated, without words, that she had seen hard things and was not afraid of them. She came in carrying 2 cups of tea and a look on her face that Imani recognized immediately, the look that meant Celestine was feeling more than she was going to say. "Good morning, my daughter," she said, setting one of the cups on the nightstand and pulling the desk chair over so she could sit close. "Good morning, Mama." They sat in silence for a moment, the way that mothers and daughters who know each other well can sit, in a silence that is not empty but full, packed with everything that has passed between them and everything that is about to. "How are you feeling?" Celestine asked. "I'm okay," Imani said. And then, because it was her wedding day and because her mother was sitting right there with silver in her hair and love in her eyes, she amended, "I'm scared and I'm happy and I'm in pain and I'm grateful. All at the same time." Celestine nodded slowly, as though this was the most reasonable answer in the world. "That sounds about right," she said. Imani looked at her mother. "Mama, I need to tell you something." Celestine set down her tea. I've been working on something. For the last few weeks. I haven't told you because I didn't want you to worry, or to hope too hard, or to. Imani, I've been trying to walk, Mama. On my own. In the mornings. Before you were up. I haven't gotten very far, and I don't know if it's going to amount to anything today, but I needed you to know. Because if something happens at the church, if I try something and it doesn't work, I need you to not fall apart. I need you to hold it together for me. The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. Celestine Okafor, who had buried a husband, raised a daughter alone, worked double shifts at Grady Memorial Hospital for 11 years, and sat in that hospital room 3 years ago when the doctor told her that her daughter might never walk again. Sat perfectly still and looked at her child. Then she reached out and took Imani's hand in both of hers. "I've known," she said quietly. Imani blinked. "What?" "I've heard you. In the mornings. I've heard you through the wall." Celestine's voice was steady, though her eyes were shining. "I didn't say anything because I knew you needed it to be yours. But I've been praying every morning since the first time I heard you trying." Imani felt something crack open in her chest. Not painfully, but the way things crack open when they have been held too tightly for too long and finally find release. She leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, and Celestine wrapped an arm around her. And they sat that way in the hotel room in the pre-dawn quiet of Atlanta while the city slowly began to wake outside, until the light through the curtains turned from gray to gold. Meanwhile, across the city in a different hotel room, in the company of his best man and his 2 groomsmen, Darius Emmanuel Whitfield was standing in front of a mirror in his tuxedo, looking like a man who was trying very hard to appear calmer than he was. Darius was 34 years old, 6 feet 2 inches tall, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of face that people trusted instinctively. Open, expressive, with dark eyes that had a way of making whoever he was looking at feel as though they were the most important person in the room. He had grown up in Decatur, Georgia, the son of a minister father and a schoolteacher mother, and he carried in his bearing the particular combination of warmth and steadiness that comes from being raised in a household where faith was not a performance but a practice. He had loved Imani Okafor for 4 years, 3 months, and 9 days. He knew the exact number because he was, despite the calm exterior, a man who paid close attention to things that mattered to him, and Imani mattered to him in a way that had reorganized his entire understanding of what mattered. He had met her at a public health conference in Washington, D.C., 2 years before the accident, before everything changed. She had been standing at the back of a panel discussion on health equity in black communities, wearing a green blazer and an expression of polite but visible skepticism at something the moderator had said, and Darius had noticed her the way you notice the one thing in a room that doesn't quite fit the expected pattern, with immediate, involuntary attention. He had found a reason to be standing near her during the coffee break afterward. They had disagreed, at length and with great mutual enjoyment, about the limitations of community health interventions that did not address structural inequality. She had made 3 arguments that he had no good counter to. He had asked for her number. 2 years later, on a Tuesday evening in September, Imani had been driving home from a late meeting when a driver who had run a red light hit the driver's side of her car at 40 miles per hour. The accident had damaged 3 vertebrae in her lumbar spine. The damage to her spinal cord was partial, which, the doctors explained, was the good news, the reason there was still feeling in her legs, the reason she was not facing a permanent and complete paralysis. But the nerve damage was severe enough that walking, standing unassisted, moving through the world the way she had moved through it for 28 years, all of that had become, suddenly and without warning, uncertain. Then increasingly unlikely. Then, in the language of medical probability, improbable. Darius had been in Chicago at a conference when he got the call. He had taken the first flight back to Atlanta and had been at Grady Memorial within 5 hours of the accident, still in his conference clothes, and he had not left the hospital for 4 days. During those 4 days, something had happened between them that was difficult to articulate in ordinary language. Something that had nothing to do with the romantic narrative of a relationship and everything to do with the kind of fundamental commitment that gets forged in extremity, in the space between what you hoped life would be and what life has actually handed you. They had not made speeches to each other. They had not exchanged dramatic declarations. But sitting in that hospital room, holding her hand while she slept, Darius had looked at the woman he loved, diminished in some ways, still entirely herself in all the ways that counted, and understood, with complete clarity, that his future had her in it. Whatever form that future took. Whatever it required of him. He had proposed 8 months later, on an ordinary Sunday afternoon in the kitchen of her apartment, while she was sitting at the kitchen table going over some work documents. He had not gone down on one knee because he had learned, in those 8 months, that the choreography of romantic gestures needed to be renegotiated when the world expected a woman to be standing and she was sitting, and the last thing he wanted was to create a moment that made Imani feel the gap between the expected image and the actual reality. So he had sat down in the chair across from her, put the ring on the table between them, and said simply, "Marry me, Imani. I don't want to do any of this without you." She had looked at the ring, and then at him, for a long, still moment. Then she had said, "You sure you know what you're signing up for?" And he had said, "I know exactly what I'm signing up for. That's why I'm asking." She had said yes. And now it was October 14th, and Darius Whitfield was standing in front of a mirror in his tuxedo with his best man, Marcus Tate. His childhood friend, the man who had driven him to the airport the night of the accident, standing behind him, straightening his bow tie with the focused expression of a man who was using a small task to manage large feelings. "You good?" Marcus asked. "I'm good," Darius said. "You don't look good. You look like you might pass out." "I'm not going to pass out. Brother, your hands are shaking." Darius looked down at his hands. They were, in fact, trembling slightly. He pressed them flat against his thighs and breathed. He stopped. Started again. "I want it to be everything she deserves. Today. I want her to feel. He paused again, searching for the right word among all the insufficient ones. I want her to feel celebrated. Not in spite of everything she's been through. Because of it. Because of who she is because of it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he put a hand on Darius's shoulder, and left it there, and said nothing, because that was the right thing to do when Marcus Tate, for all his jokes and his noise and his general inability to be serious for more than 30 consecutive seconds, knew when the right thing was silence. Greater Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church had been standing at the corner of Vine Street and MLK Drive on Atlanta's west side since 1962. It was not the largest church in the city. It was not the most architecturally distinguished. But it had the quality that the oldest black churches in the American South often possess, a quality of accumulated witness, as though the building itself had absorbed, over decades, the prayers and the grief and the joy and the survival of everyone who had passed through its doors, and had been made solid by that absorption, made real in a way that newer structures, however grand, could not quite replicate. The sanctuary seated 300 people. Today, 247 of those seats were filled. They had come from Atlanta and from Charlotte and from Lagos and from Houston. They were grandmothers in wide-brimmed hats and cousins in borrowed suits and colleagues who had rearranged international travel schedules to be present and childhood friends who had not seen each other in years and church mothers who had known Celestine Okafor for 30 years and had prayed over Imani since she was a little girl with box braids and a gap-toothed smile sitting in the third pew from the front. They had come because a wedding is an occasion, but they had also come because this particular wedding, Imani and Darius, this specific union, on this specific day, carried weight that everyone in both families understood. They had watched Imani fight. Some of them had fought alongside her. All of them had prayed for her, in their various ways and with their various degrees of faith. And today, gathered in a church that smelled of old wood and good perfume and the particular combination of hairspray and flower arrangements that always characterize these occasions, they were here to witness her be celebrated. What none of them knew, what only Celestine knew, and now silently held, was what Imani had told her mother that morning in the hotel room. The wedding coordinator, a brisk, organized woman named Phyllis Monroe who had been coordinating weddings in Atlanta for 22 years and had seen, she was fond of saying, absolutely everything. Phyllis did not know either. She had been given instructions that were straightforward enough. The bride would be in her wheelchair, accompanied down the aisle by her mother on her left and her father's photograph held by her godfather on her right. Imani's father, Emeka, had passed away 5 years earlier, and this was the family's quiet, dignified way of making space for his presence. And the ceremony would proceed with all the joy and solemnity that the occasion demanded. Phyllis had nodded, made her notes, and had spent the previous 2 weeks ensuring that the church was accessible, that the aisle was wide enough, that the positioning at the altar would work comfortably, that every logistical detail that could be anticipated had been anticipated. She was very good at her job. But she had not anticipated this. None of them had anticipated this. Inside the bridal suite at the back of the church, a room that in an earlier era had been the pastor's study and had been converted, with the addition of a full-length mirror and a small vanity table and better lighting, into a space where brides could make their final preparations. Imani Okafor sat in her wheelchair in her wedding dress and looked at herself in the mirror. The dress had been designed by a woman named Adiz Mensah, a bridal designer from Accra who had been introduced to Imani through a mutual friend and who had spent 6 months creating something that was not what anyone expected a bride in a wheelchair to wear. It was not modest. It was not restrained. It was architectural and extraordinary. A strapless ivory gown with a fitted bodice embroidered with hand-stitched Kent-inspired geometric patterns in gold thread that caught and held the light every time Imani shifted her position, with a full cathedral-length skirt that pooled around the wheelchair in a way that was not an accommodation but a deliberate design element. The fabric arranged so that the chair was incorporated into the visual composition rather than hidden from it. Adiz had said to Imani, during the final fitting, "You are not a bride who happens to be in a wheelchair. You are Imani. And everything about this dress will say that." Looking at herself in the mirror now, Imani thought that Adiz had been right. Her makeup had been done by her best friend, Kezia Williams, a makeup artist by trade and by calling who had been Imani's friend since the first week of freshman year at Spelman and who had done Imani's makeup for every significant occasion in the intervening 13 years. Today, Kezia had outdone herself. The look was warm and luminous and deeply, deliberately, beautifully black. Golden tones on deep brown skin, full lips in a deep berry shade, lashes that were dramatic without being theatrical, and Kezia's signature touch, a small application of gold leaf at the outer corners of Imani's eyes that caught the light in a way that made her look, in the very best sense, otherworldly. Her hair, natural, 4C coils that she had been growing for 3 years, had been styled by her other best friend, Tiffany Reeves, into an elaborate updo threaded with small white flowers and gold pins that was part bridal crown and part work of art. She looked extraordinary. She knew she looked extraordinary. She was not going to pretend otherwise. Her bridesmaids, Kezia in deep burgundy, Tiffany in deep burgundy, and Imani's cousin Zara in the same, were gathered around her, making the small adjustments and the carefully managed expressions that bridesmaids make on wedding mornings when they are trying very hard to hold the emotional weight of the occasion at a manageable distance. Imani looked at them in the mirror. These women who had driven her to appointments and brought her food when she couldn't cook and sat with her through the worst nights and the best ones. These women who had not flinched, not once, not in 3 years. "Okay," she said. "I need to tell you all something. And I need you to promise me that you will not lose your composure, because I cannot have people falling apart before we even get to the altar." 3 pairs of eyes looked at her. "I've been working on something," she said, "for the last few weeks. I need you to be ready for the possibility that today might look a little different from what we planned." Kezia narrowed her eyes. "Imani Adiz Okafor. What did you do?" "I haven't done anything yet," Imani said carefully. "But I might. And if I do—" She stopped and looked at her own reflection again, and the woman looking back at her had gold at the corners of her eyes and a cathedral dress with Kent embroidery and 3 years of pain and faith and stubborn, impossible hope written into the set of her jaw. "If I do," she said again, more quietly, "I need you with me." The room was silent for a moment. Then Zara, who was the quietest of the 3 and the one who always seemed to understand what was happening beneath the surface of things, stepped forward and knelt in front of Imani's wheelchair so they were eye to eye. "We're always with you," she said. "Simply. Without ceremony. Whatever happens today, we're always with you." The church was full and warm and vibrating with the particular low-frequency energy that large gatherings of people carry when they are emotionally primed for something significant. The groomsmen had taken their places at the front of the church. Marcus at Darius's side, sharp in his burgundy tie and pocket square, doing an admirable job of projecting an air of serene composure that was entirely at odds with the state of his actual nervous system. The other groomsmen, Jalen and Terence, flanked the 2 of them, tall and handsome and well-rehearsed in their stillness. And at the front of it all, at the top of those 3 steps that led to the altar, stood the Reverend Dr. James Osei, a man of 63 years who had been Darius's father's closest friend and who had known Darius since he was 8 years old. Reverend Osei was a small, compact man with a magnificent white beard and reading glasses perpetually perched on his head, and he stood before his congregation with the comfortable authority of a man who had presided over more significant moments in more people's lives than he could count, and who had learned, through all of them, that the most important thing he could do at any wedding was get out of the way and let the love in the room do its work. Darius stood at the altar. He had not been told anything. No one had said anything to him. He stood there in his tuxedo, black with a Kent-patterned bow tie and pocket square that Imani had chosen, her nod to his heritage and her own, and he looked out at the faces of the people he loved and the people Imani loved gathered in this old church on a golden October morning, and he felt something vast and quiet moving through him that he did not have adequate words for. The processional began. The bridesmaids came first, Zara, then Kezia, then Tiffany, each of them composed and beautiful in their burgundy, each of them carrying something in their expressions that Darius could not quite read, something that sat just below the surface of their wedding day smiles like a secret that was about to become a story. He noticed it, filed it away, said nothing. Then the doors at the back of the church opened for the second time, and the organ swelled. At the back of the church, behind those closed doors, in the vestibule that smelled of wood polish and old hymnals and the ghost of 1,000 Sundays, Imani Okafor was doing something that no one on the other side of those doors knew she was doing. She was standing up. Not easily. Not gracefully. Not without pain. Her mother was on her left, one hand under Imani's elbow, one hand pressed flat against the small of her daughter's back. Not pushing, not pulling, just present, a solid, warm, breathing anchor. Celestine's face was arranged into an expression of fierce, concentrated calm, the way her face had been arranged through every hard thing in her life. because Celestine Okafor had learned a long time ago that her daughter took her emotional cues from her, and today, of all days, she was not going to waver. Imani's hands were gripping the handles of the wheelchair. She was using it not as a seat but as a walker, a support, something to hold on to as she tested the weight on her legs, as her nervous system negotiated the ancient, complicated calculus of upright locomotion with the damaged wiring it had been left with. Her legs were trembling. The pain in her lower back was significant. But the pain was not unbearable. She had sat with this pain for 3 years. She knew its dimensions. She knew where it ended. Tiffany was on her right, close but not touching, ready. Kezia was behind them. Zara had been dispatched to the front to take her place in the procession. "Imani," her mother said, very quietly. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Imani said. Her voice was steady. "Mama, I know." She shifted her weight forward. Her left leg took it, shakily, impossibly. Her right leg moved. She took a step. One single, trembling, real, actual step. The breath that left her mother's body was not quite a sob and not quite a gasp, but something in between. Something that Celestine immediately recaptured and held, pressing her lips together, eyes fixed on her daughter. Imani took another step. And then another. She was not walking the way she used to walk. This was not the easy, automatic locomotion of a body that had never had to think about what walking meant. Every step was a negotiation, a conscious choice, a demand she was making of muscles and nerves that had been silent for 3 years. Her pace was slow. Her grip on the wheelchair handles was white-knuckled. But she was moving forward. She was upright. She was walking. The doors opened. What happened in the next 23 seconds was the kind of thing that people in that church would describe, for the rest of their lives, in the specific way that people describe moments they were not prepared for. Not just what they saw, but what they felt, what their body did before their brain caught up with what was happening. The first person to understand what they were seeing was Reverend Osei. He was standing at the altar, positioned to see the full length of the aisle, and he saw the doors open, and he saw Celestine, and he saw the wheelchair. And then he saw, just behind the wheelchair, the unmistakable motion of a woman walking. His hands, clasped in front of him, tightened involuntarily. His lips parted. He made no sound. He was a man of 63 years of faith, and in those 63 years he had held the belief, intellectually, theologically, that miracles were possible. But there is a difference, as every person of faith eventually discovers, between believing abstractly that miracles are possible and standing in a church on an October morning watching one happen in front of your eyes. The second person to understand was Marcus. Marcus Tate was standing at the altar at Darius's left shoulder, and he had the angle to see clearly, and he understood 3 or 4 seconds before most people in the church, and what happened to his face in those 3 or 4 seconds was the most honest thing anyone in that building had seen in years. A sequence of pure, unguarded emotions moving across his features like weather across an open landscape. Shock. Confusion. Dawning comprehension. Joy so large and sudden it looked almost like pain. He turned his head to look at Darius. And stopped himself. Because Darius had not yet seen. Darius was looking toward the doors with the focused, emotional attention of a groom watching for his bride. But the angle was slightly off, the distance and the positioning of the guests creating a partial obstruction, and he had not yet, quite, understood what he was seeing. Then the congregation did. It started in the first few rows. A sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a cry, but something primitive and involuntary. The sound that human beings make when the world suddenly shows them something they had stopped believing was possible. An elderly woman in the second row, Imani's great-aunt Josephine, 81 years old, hat tilted at a magnificent angle, who had been sitting in black churches for 7 decades and had seen many things, put both hands over her mouth and made a sound that was the vocal equivalent of a prayer being answered. The sound spread through the congregation the way fire spreads through dry grass. Not all at once, but in a wave, pew by pew, as more and more faces turned and understood and responded, each response personal and uncontainable. A woman near the back pressing both hands to her chest, a man 3 rows up gripping his wife's arm without looking at her. Children who did not fully understand what was happening but felt the electricity of the adult emotion around them and went still and wide-eyed. And Darius. Darius heard the sound from the congregation before he understood the cause of it. He heard that sound and something in him shifted, some instinct older than thought, and he turned fully to look down the aisle. And he saw her. He saw Imani, standing upright, walking toward him. Slowly, with effort, with trembling legs and a grip on the wheelchair, she was pushing in front of her as though it were a walker. Her cathedral dress spread around her feet in gold-threaded ivory. Her face arranged into an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite tears, but something that contained both. Imani Adiz Okafor was walking down the aisle of Greater Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church on October 14th, doing the thing that 3 years of pain and medical probability and hard, merciless reality had told her she would not do. Walking to him. Darius Whitfield, who had stayed composed through 4 days in a hospital and 8 months of recovery and a year of planning and all the ways that loving someone who is struggling asks you to be strong for them. Darius Whitfield, who was 6 feet 2 inches tall and had inherited from his minister father the ability to hold his feelings at a slight remove when the occasion required it, stood at the altar of Greater Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church and fell completely, catastrophically, beautifully apart. He did not crumple. He did not look away. He stood and he watched her walk toward him, and the tears ran down his face freely and without apology, and he made no move to stop them, because there was nothing in him capable of stopping them, because the woman he loved, the woman he was about to promise his life to, was walking, was standing, was moving toward him through an aisle full of people who were now weeping openly, through a church that had filled with sound, through a morning that had been golden and had become something even more than that, something that did not have a name in ordinary language. He pressed his lips together. His jaw worked. He breathed. She kept walking, step by step, slowly, surely, all the way down. The sound that filled Greater Ebenezer Missionary Baptist Church in the moments after the congregation understood what they were witnessing was not a single sound but a composition. Layered, involuntary, and deeply human. It was the sound of 247 people being surprised by grace at the same moment, each of them processing it through their own particular history of hope and disappointment and faith and doubt, and it rose to the old wooden rafters of that church and stayed there, hanging in the warm October air like something visible. Imani heard it. She heard every layer of it, the gasps and the crying and the low, reverent sounds from the older women in the congregation who had lived long enough to recognize a miracle when they were looking at one, and the laughter from people who had no other container for what they were feeling, and underneath all of it, steady as a heartbeat, the sound of Reverend Osei's voice beginning a low, quiet invocation that he had not planned and was not reading from any text, speaking from somewhere beneath. His prepared remarks into a moment that had rendered all preparation irrelevant. She heard all of it, and she kept walking. This was the part that cost her the most. Not the standing, which she had practiced, and not the first few steps, which adrenaline and weeks of early morning work had prepared her for, but the sustained effort of continuing, of asking her body to keep doing the thing it had agreed to do, of managing the pain and the trembling and the very real possibility that her legs might simply stop cooperating before she reached him. She had made a decision, back in the vestibule, in the moment before the doors opened. She had decided that if her legs gave out, if she fell, if she could not make it the full length of the aisle under her own power, she would not be ashamed. She would sit back in the wheelchair, and she would be wheeled the rest of the way, and she would arrive at that altar, and she would marry Darius Emmanuel Whitfield, and it would still be the best day of her life. The walking was not the point. The walking was not what made today sacred. But she had also decided that she was going to give everything she had. And so she kept walking. Her mother stayed with her, one hand barely touching her elbow. There more as a presence than a support, a silent testament that Celestine understood the distinction between helping and accompanying, and had chosen, on this particular morning, to accompany. Tiffany walked on the other side, equally present, equally restrained, her face a study in the kind of controlled emotion that requires extraordinary effort. The aisle of Greater Ebenezer was 63 feet long. Imani had measured it, on a Wednesday afternoon 2 months ago, when she had come to the church for a planning meeting with Phyllis and had asked, very casually, as if idle curiosity had prompted the question rather than careful calculation, how long the center aisle was. 63 feet. She was, she estimated, at roughly the halfway point when she saw Darius's face clearly for the first time. When the distance between them had closed enough for her to make out his expression rather than just his silhouette, and what she saw on his face stopped her breath for just a moment, threatened to destabilize something in her chest that she could not afford to have destabilized right now. Not with 30 feet still between them and her legs already asking serious questions about how. Much longer she was going to insist on this. He was crying. Not delicately. Not in the restrained, dignified way that men at weddings sometimes cry. A single tear, quickly blinked away, deniable. Darius was crying the way people cry when something reaches them at a level that bypasses every socially constructed mechanism for managing public emotion, when the feeling is simply larger than the container, when there is nothing to do but let it come. He was standing completely still, both hands pressed flat over his mouth, his shoulders moving with the effort of breathing through what he was feeling, and he was watching her walk toward him with an expression that she had never seen on his face before. Not in 4 years of knowing him, not in 3 years of hard things and harder things and the accumulated daily intimacies of loving someone through their worst season. It was an expression compounded of too many things to name individually. Love, obviously, that was the bedrock, but also astonishment, and something that looked like relief in a very profound key, and something that she could only describe, later, in the quiet of a hotel room on the other side of the wedding, as reverence. He looked at her the way you look at something you had been afraid to hope for. She kept walking. 50 feet. 40. 30. The congregation had settled into a new quality of silence. Not the silence before something happens, but the silence of people who are witnessing something happening and understand that the appropriate response is to be still and bear witness. Here and there a quiet sob, the rustle of someone reaching for a program to press to their face, the particular stillness of children who had absorbed from the adults around them that this was a moment requiring their best behavior. Imani was at 20 feet when her left knee buckled. It was slight, a momentary instability, her weight shifting wrong, a nerve that had simply run out of whatever it had been running on. Her mother's hand tightened on her elbow immediately, steady and sure. Imani gripped the wheelchair handles and redistributed her weight and breathed and stood and did not fall. 10 feet. At 10 feet she could see the gold flecks in Darius's eyes, the way she had always been able to see them when they were close. Those specific flecks that caught light in a way that made his eyes look warm even in ordinary light and extraordinary right now, in this church, on this morning, with everything they both knew and felt and had survived between them. She stopped in front of him. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and the church held its breath. Then Darius took both of her hands in his, gently, the way he had learned to touch her, with a particular tenderness that had developed over 3 years of understanding that her body required a different kind of attention than it once had, not less love but more consciousness, and he said her name. Just her name. Imani. And in the way he said it, with every year of knowing her and every day of choosing her and every night of praying for her packed into those 3 syllables, she felt it travel through her hands where he was holding them and up through her arms and into her chest where it expanded into something too large for her body. She sat down in the wheelchair. Not because she had to, but because she was ready to. Because she had done what she came to do, and now she was ready for the next part. The part that she had been preparing for not for 11 weeks, but for 4 years. The part where she married this man. Reverend Osei cleared his throat gently. He removed his reading glasses from the top of his head, put them on, looked down at his notes, and then looked back up at the congregation over the rims of the glasses with an expression that was half the wisdom of 63 years and half the barely contained emotion of a man who had just been reminded, forcefully and publicly, why he had spent his life in ministry. "Dearly beloved," he said. And then he paused for just a moment, because even Reverend James Osei needed a moment. We are gathered together, in the sight of God and in the presence of this community, to witness and celebrate one of life's greatest relationships, the joining of Imani Adiz Okafor and Darius Emmanuel Whitfield in marriage. He looked at the two of them. "I have performed many wedding ceremonies in my time," he said. "I have stood in many sacred spaces with many remarkable couples. But I want to say, before we proceed, and I believe God will forgive me the departure from the prepared text, that what this community has just witnessed, in this aisle, on this morning, is a testimony." He let the word sit. Some of you in this room have been praying for this young woman for 3 years. Some of you have sat with her in her pain. Some of you have believed when believing was hard. And what I want you to understand is that what you just saw was not coincidence. It was not performance. What you just saw was the intersection of human faith and divine grace, and I want us to hold that, all of us, as we witness what comes next. The church said amen. Not performatively, not in the rote way that amens sometimes come, but from the inside out, from the gut, from the specific place where the deepest agreements live. Darius was still holding Imani's hands. He had not let go. He did not let go for the entire ceremony. The vows were traditional, the old, worn, magnificent words of the ceremony, words that had been said in countless churches over countless centuries and had not lost their power, the power of their longevity, the weight of every time they had been said truly. But Reverend Osei had asked both Imani and Darius if they wished to add personal statements, and both of them had said yes. Darius went first. He had written his statement over the course of 3 months. He had drafted it and discarded the drafts and started again more times than he could accurately count, because every time he tried to put down what he wanted to say, the words came out wrong, too formal, or too effusive, or not enough of what he meant and too much of what he thought a groom was supposed to say. He had, in the end, stopped trying to write something impressive and had simply written something true. He looked at Imani. He did not look at the paper. "Imani," he said. 3 years ago, I sat in a hospital room and I watched you come back from something that would have broken most people. And what I saw," he paused, breathed, continued. "What I saw was not someone who was surviving. What I saw was someone who was deciding, every single day, to still be herself, to still be present, to still choose joy when joy required effort, to still argue with me about structural inequality over the phone at 11 o'clock at night when you were supposed to be resting." A soft, rippled laugh moved through the congregation. "And I thought, this woman, this specific woman, there is no one else." He held her hands more tightly. "I want to make you a promise today that is not about the good times, because I know we're going to have good times. I want to make you a promise about the ordinary times, the Tuesday evenings and the early mornings and the moments when life is not extraordinary, when it's just life, when it's hard and repetitive and requires patience from both of us. I promise you that in all of those moments, in every ordinary and difficult and unremarkable day, I will see you, not a version of you, not the you I wish things had been different for. You, exactly as you are, exactly as you will be. I will see you every day for the rest of my life. And I will thank God every day for the fact that you said yes." He stopped speaking. The church was entirely silent. Imani looked at him for a long moment. The gold at the corners of her eyes caught the light coming through the stained glass windows behind the altar, amber and rose and a deep saturated blue, and she looked, in that light, like something painted rather than living, except that everything about her was irrefutably, powerfully alive. She had her own paper. She did not look at it either. "Darius," she said. Her voice was clear and even, though what it cost her to keep it that way was something only she and her mother fully understood. "I have been many things in the last 3 years. I've been strong and I've been weak and I've been faithful and I've been furious and I've been afraid in ways I had never been afraid before. I've had to learn things about myself that I did not ask to learn." She paused. "And one of the things I learned, one of the things I know now at 31, that I did not know at 28, is that love is not what rescues you. Love is what walks alongside you while you rescue yourself." She watched his face absorb that. "You never tried to fix me," she said. "You never made me feel like I was a problem to be solved or a tragedy to be managed. You made me feel like a woman, a whole woman, not despite anything, just, completely, and without condition, a whole woman." She stopped again. And this time there was a pause in which the silence in the church was so complete that the sound of Reverend Osei drawing a quiet breath was audible in the front rows. "I told you, the morning after the accident, when you were sitting beside my bed and you thought I was asleep. I heard you. I heard you say that you didn't know how to pray but that you were going to figure it out because I needed someone praying for me. I heard that." A visible tremor moved through her voice and she steadied it. "I've been praying for you ever since. And I'm going to keep praying for you. Every day. For the rest of our lives." She took a breath. "I love you, Darius. I love who you are and I love who you make me want to be, and I love that you put the Kent on your bow tie today, even though you were nervous about whether it would work with the tuxedo, and it absolutely works." Another soft, warm laugh from the congregation. The laugh of people who needed a breath and were grateful for it. "I'm ready," she said quietly. "I've been ready for a long time." When they exchanged rings, the simple gold bands that Imani had chosen, unadorned, because she believed that the truest things did not require ornamentation, The sound from the congregation was organic and unplanned, the kind of collective sound that only happens when a large group of people is moved beyond their individual capacity to contain it. A sound that was grief and joy and memory and gratitude all at once. The sound of people who had been carrying hope for a long time and were, at this specific moment, in this church on this October morning, putting it down. Reverend Osei waited for the sound to subside. "By the power vested in me," he said, and his voice, for all his composure, was not entirely steady. "By the state of Georgia and by the authority of the Almighty God who I have served for 40 years and who continues, even now, to astonish me." He paused there, and no one in the church filled the pause, because it did not need filling. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." He looked at Darius. "You may kiss your bride." Darius leaned down toward Imani. She reached up toward him. And the kiss they exchanged was not the brief, ceremonial kiss of people performing for an audience. It was private in its essence despite the crowd that witnessed it. The kiss of two people communicating something for which the ceremony had already given all the words it had, and this was the language that came after words. The church erupted.